I'm Father Michael Orsi. I am your host for Action for Life Television, that good news program which brings you the big G for the gospel of Jesus Christ and the little g, all the good things that people do to put that gospel of life into action. Ladies and gentlemen, over these many years, we've had many programs discussing the beginning of life, conception, and talking about how sacred human life is and that the life in the womb must be protected. We've had many people coming onto the program telling you about what they do to protect unborn life and the mothers who are involved with bringing new life into the world. Today, we're going to go to the other end of the spectrum. What do I mean by that? We're going to talk about death. However, we're going to talk about euthanasia. You know what that means? Euthanasia means either killing yourself directly or having someone else do the deed for you. And this is becoming more and more prevalent around the world. You've heard of cases in Canada, not too far away, but also it's beginning to take hold in the United States. I think there are about 6, 7, or 8 states, something like that. We'll have our guest fill us in on the exact number that permit, well, we call it physician-assisted suicide. Now, many years ago, we heard about Dr. Kevorkian. I lived in Michigan at that time. He was a cause célèbre. Well, Dr. Kevorkian is dead, but his movement lives on. So today we have with us a guest who is an expert in speaking about euthanasia and how to prevent euthanasia. He's with the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and his name is Alex Shadenberg. And so, Alex, I want to welcome you today to our program. Can you tell us, how did you get involved with euthanasia?
Well, first of all, I'm a Canadian, so some of the things I might get into, I'm just going to stick to the general story, but I got involved with this issue in the 1990s, a long time ago. So that was closer to the time of Jack Kevorkian in a sense. Nonetheless, in Canada, there had been a case of a woman with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, who had wanted to die by euthanasia. She wanted her doctor to be able to kill her, and she went through the courts, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, where she was turned down. They said, no, we're not changing the laws on homicide, because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about euthanasia. We're talking about homicide. And then there was another case of a farmer in Saskatchewan who killed his daughter, who was 11 years old. He killed her because she had cerebral palsy. And this was soon after the one court case with the one with ALS. And that went through the courts also because he claimed it was something, he called it force majeure. He said he had to do it because he had to end her suffering. In fact, he killed his daughter intentionally, and that's in the end how he did go to jail correctly. But in Canada now, since those days, of course, we've legalized euthanasia. Now I'm gonna give people a quick definition first, though, Father, because I think it's good in this discussion. Euthanasia is what we do in Canada, sadly, and that's by lethal injection. And how we legalize euthanasia in Canada, and same as in the Netherlands, is we created an exception to homicide. So in our criminal code, they passed a law that creates an exception to homicide. So as I say, the only thing honest about the law is that it calls it homicide, because that's what it is, murder. Whereas assisted suicide is using the same drugs, it's the same intention to end a person's life, but technically the person has to do it themselves. So they're given a prescription for those lethal drugs, but they have to consume it themselves rather than having the doctor inject them. And those are the differences. Yeah.
There used to be a term, it was called passive and active euthanasia.
Correct.
Is that what you're speaking about?
No, I'm talking about euthanasia in the active sense in this case, because it's by lethal injection. When we talked about passive euthanasia, they were talking about intentionally denying someone basic care, such as food and fluids, such as something basic to them in order to have their death come about.
Okay, so let's talk about this, folks. This is a very important distinction that I want to make over here. When you have, for instance, physician-assisted euthanasia, that means that the physician or a nurse will administer to you a lethal injection. It's similar to putting down a cat or a dog. All right, I don't want to be, crass, but that's exactly what it's like. Passive euthanasia is when somebody says, I don't want to eat anymore, I want to die. And they will just decide that they're going to stay in bed and they're not going to eat anymore. And they are literally killing themselves. Or it could simply be, I refuse to take my medicine. Medicine that could help me to live. It could be a very simple kind of medicine, nothing exotic or painful, but I don't want to take my high blood pressure pill anymore. Just let's make believe, okay? And therefore, I'm going to allow myself to die. Am I right on that? How that works?
Well, let's make it very clear. Usually, if you're talking about something like a passive euthanasia, it'd be more like a Terry Schiavo case where she was not in coma. She had, she was in a type of state where she, of course, was completely incompetent. And her husband in that case decided that they would deny her any fluids. So she died of dehydration. That would be a very clear case that people can understand. When we get into the medical treatment case, and because obviously, as you know, with the church's teaching, we have the right to refuse medical treatment. But at the same time, we recognize in the Catholic sense that our life is not our own and we are to defend our life. So you have this sort of a tension between.
Let's talk about that, okay? Certainly the Terry Schiavo case, they did nothing actively to kill her as far as we know. They did not inject her with something that would end her life, stop her heart from beating. They simply withdrew any kind of nourishment, food, hydration, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we have to make distinctions about this also because when someone's nearing death, so let's say you're in palliative care and you're nearing death and the body is shutting down and there's, your kidneys, your liver, these things are either not functioning or coming very close to stopping and they're functioning, or your circulatory system shutting down. At a certain point, it might become futile, or there's no purpose to providing food or fluids to that person, not because we want them to die or we're trying to cause their death, but because there is nothing that it does for them anymore. In the case of Terry Schiavo, she wasn't dying, you see, so the intention of removing the fluids was to kill her, and she died of dehydration. So you can see the clear distinctions here. The intention around euthanasia is to kill. That's the purpose of it. Euthanasia is about killing somebody. It's not about allowing to die. We have no problem with, someone recognizing the limits of their life and the limits of their physical body and accepting that natural death is occurring. But we do have a problem with killing somebody.
Okay. Folks, as you know, old Father O gets to the hospital quite often. And we do have people who are at the end of their life. And of course, the decision has to be made as to whether or not we're going to keep them on, for instance, a respirator or put in a feeding tube. And oftentimes, we know that that would be futile. And so in discussions with the family, we're going to say, let's let nature take its course. They are in the process of dying. We're not causing the death, but we're not prolonging the heart from beating. So that's the distinction that we're trying to make over here today. But I want to ask you this one. Suppose I am, ill, but not that ill. All right, not that ill. I'm just depressed. And the doctor says, hey, look, you're a diabetic. All right, and I am. I'm a diabetic, okay? And I say to him, oh, yeah, I know, but I want to die. And I decide not to take my insulin. Well, where does that fall?
Well, I think you'd be talking about it. It comes down, in a sense, closer to a form of suicide because you're saying no to insulin. You see,
Father O's on top of this. Go ahead.
Yeah, because you're saying no to insulin, which is a basic care. It's not providing it. It's not, how would you say, a hardship. You see, let's make the distinction clear. So let's say you had cancer. So now we're not talking about insulin, which is a basic thing, which is not extraordinary. It's not difficult on you. It's not providing a burden to you. But let's say at a certain point with the cancer treatment, the burden has become so great upon you that you're just saying, I'm thinking that the treatment is worse than the actual disease, and I think I have to accept the limits of my life, that I'm going to die, and that's okay because no one's trying to kill me here. I'm just accepting that at a certain point I can't do this any longer. That's a clear distinction between just accepting that my life has a physical nature, and I'm not going to live forever, but there's nothing morally wrong with saying I'm not accepting that treatment. You know,
Okay.
there's a clear distinction because it's extraordinary. It may have great harm for you. But if you deny someone a basic care, you know what I'm saying? So fluids do not provide any hardship to you. And I'm making that clear distinction, of course, again, between the person who's nearing death, who putting fluid in their body when they're nearing death just doesn't make sense anymore because the body isn't using it even anymore. The body
Right.
is so close to death that what's the purpose of putting fluid into a body that's nearing death or food into a body that's nearing death like that? We accept that, yes, they're passing away very soon. And that's very different than denying it to someone intentionally because they're not dying and we want them to die.
Right. So, folks, we can decide not to accept certain kind of treatment because, and this comes right out of Pope Pius XII, addressed to the Italian midwives, if a treatment is too painful, too costly, too exotic, or it would lead one to despair. Suppose I just said to myself, look, I'm not dying I'm dying because I have other conditions, but if I had a feeding tube put in me, I could live longer. But I say, but that's repulsive to me. I don't want a feeding tube. I can't live like that. It would cause me to go into despair. I don't have to do that either, okay? So we want to make those distinctions with you, okay? Now, why I have Alex on here today, we're not talking about simply extraordinary means or ordinary means of preserving life. What we're talking about here is when we have people who decide that they don't want to live anymore, and therefore the state sanctions whether or not they can end their life or have someone else assist them in ending their life. And of course, we have some places even where the states are making those decisions now, saying this life is worth living, this life is not worth living, and they have people who will administer the final solution, if you will. Okay, so Alex, talk to us now about that. We got through all the moral stuff.
Yeah.
Now we're going to talk about a lot of immoral stuff. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think it's important to make that distinction, but it's also important to recognize that, yes, there's clear differences between an act which will cause death and an act which may or may not cause death. So with assisted suicide, the intention is to give them these lethal drugs that do cause their death. And the problem with this right off the bat is that you have a doctor then agreeing or deciding, hopefully they answer my phone right away. But anyway, they have a doctor agreeing or deciding that, yes, I agree with you, your life is not worth living. So I'm going to prescribe to you these lethal drugs, and you're going to take these lethal drugs, and it will cause your death. So therefore, the doctor is now directly complicit and active in an act to cause the death of a person. And this is a clear situation that's problematic for all of us. And then let's get into this. I like to simplify this issue first of all, so we understand it right off the bat, because some people will say, yeah, but Alex, there's people suffering, there's people going through this and they're going through that. And I say, yes, but is it okay ever to be involved with killing another human being? Because that's essentially what we're talking about here. We're saying it's okay for doctors or nurses to kill another human being because they've requested it. And just because they've requested it, now it's okay. I can't ever say that it's okay for one person to kill another person. So right off the bat, this is the basic thing, and we shouldn't be confused about, oh, well, maybe they're going through this. No, this is about killing. It's not about accidental killing, and it's not about withdrawing treatment. It's about actual killing.
Okay, but it's either way. It's either way. Either the doctor says, actively, I'm going to give you these, help you swallow these pills or take this injection, or passively, I'm just going to leave them near your bed and you take them when you're ready.
Yeah, but that wouldn't be passive either, because that's active, because now the doctor's directly complicit in the act. They've prescribed, they've provided, they've given instructions, and yes, the person's taking it themselves. But the fact of it is you can't separate the act from the person who's been directly involved in the act. So it's assisted suicide is clearly not passive, and that's why it must be illegal and it must be prohibited. You can't.
Suppose the person decides, well, I want to die, and I'm just going to starve myself. Is that an example?
No, that's a different sort of thing, because once again, that's more akin to a suicide. It's a self-act. At the same time, A lot of people go through these things, as you know, Father, because they're experiencing psychological or emotional issues. And that's, or they're really going through this feeling of hopelessness as they're approaching, their end of life conditions. And, when we're looking at someone who's become suicidal or has suicidal ideation, we have to recognize the need to care for them and the interconnectedness of the human person and my responsibility to them. It's not acceptable for me to abandon that person to death. It's just simply not acceptable. And yet, because assisted suicide becomes legal, suddenly we're not only abandoning them, we're actually directly involved with the act in helping them cause their death.
Let's try to clarify this for the gang out there watching us. All right, suppose I have somebody sick in bed. They are depressed, and I decide, let me help them die, and I refuse to feed them. Sick kid.
Well, it depends. It depends if the person's capable of feeding themselves or not.
Well, you got a kid.
But if you refuse to feed them and they're capable of eating effectively,
right,
and you're directly involved with that act, that would be
murder.
Completely wrong.
That's murder.
Well, I don't think the law would define that as murder, because these are interesting distinctions we're making, right?
Yeah.
I don't think the law would define it that way, but it would certainly be denial of the basic necessaries of life, which I think is a serious thing to do to someone. And I'm sure as a priest you've come to people at the bedside many times, and they might have said to you, "Father, I don't know why I'm still alive."
Right.
And the point of it is they weren't saying to you, "Father, please kill me." What they were doing is they were going through a normal human reality of existential distress or emotional questioning or depression, or maybe they're just having a very difficult time with their current situation, and they're actually seeking help, emotional, psychological, spiritual help from you, and that's why they're saying these things. But the problem with legalizing assisted suicide is if they were to express that, saying, "I don't know why I'm still alive," that might be taken as a request for assisted suicide, and then the doctor becomes directly involved with the act of providing those lethal drugs.
So the doctor becomes complicit in the suicide. Right. All right.
That's right.
All right.
And they're directly complicit. It's not accidentally or secondarily or anything like that.
As you can imagine, producing this wonderful program, Action for Life, it costs a great deal of money. We're going to need your help. So if you would like to donate to keep this good news program on the air, please go to your computer, your cell phone, actionforlife.net. Our thought for the day: I hope that all of you have Bibles in your home. The Bible is the Word of God, and there's nothing more powerful than God's Word. Keep it in a prominent place to remind you that you are part of God's good news and that God is using you to do His will. Okay, I want to ask you one last thing before we move on to something else. When you talk about passive euthanasia, what do you mean by that? The folks want a distinction here.
Right. So I tend not to get heavily into that question because it is denying the basic necessaries of life. So usually we're talking about, as I say, denying fluids to someone who's incompetent to make decisions for themselves, such as someone with dementia, etc., for the purpose of causing their death. So therefore, that means they're still capable of assimilating. They're still, it's still of great benefit to them. It's not like they're nearing death, but we are actually causing their death intentionally. So that would become a type of a passive euthanasia. The problem with all these things, Father, is how the laws have changed and how ethics have changed. So getting into these questions is far more difficult now than it was, let's say, in the 1950s, when we had a clear understanding that you just didn't do that. Right? We just didn't abandon people to death. We just didn't do that. We would accept the limits of life, but we We didn't do that. And now today, that's becoming commonplace that that's okay to do. The other question comes up around the issue of, in palliative care, when someone's receiving large doses of painkillers, analgesics, and they might need that to control their pain. And of course, we have to recognize that it is possible that there's a secondary effect, that the person might die prematurely because of the painkillers.
Do you hear that, folks? Alice just said something about a secondary effect. It's very important. We do have a lot of people, that they're suffering painfully from a disease, oftentimes cancer. They get involved with hospice, either at home or they go to a hospice facility, and hospice then gives them morphine, morphine. And hospice could legitimately and morally give them as much morphine as they need to kill the pain. The idea is not to kill the person. The idea is to lessen the pain. And that's always been accepted by moral theologians, churches, that is completely legitimate. We're talking about something very different here.
That's right.
Oftentimes, this does not necessarily involve physical illness. It oftentimes, though, involves mental illness or someone that society may deem to be not worth having around anymore if you get my gist. In other words, if you have somebody who is mentally defective in some way, physically defective in some way, and society says, now with state approval, unfortunately, that you may help to end this person's life. Is this what's going on in the States now and in Canada and Belgium?
Well, right. There's 10 states in the U.S. that allow assisted suicide. Canada, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and now Spain allow euthanasia, which is lethal injection. There's no laws in the U.S. yet that allow for lethal injection, but the assisted suicide lobby has been pushing for that in the U.S. They would certainly like that also. And so let's be very clear again, and I make this very clear. This is the intentional cause of death. When we get into the reasons, people would say, but isn't this about choice? I'll say, Father, aren't these people requesting it themselves? Isn't it about their choice? And it's not about their choice, and this is a big lie. It's not about their choice, because yes, they might ask for it. That's true. They might ask for it. It's about the decision that the doctor makes, that they agree that yes, your life is not worth living. They prescribe you the lethal drugs. They're directly affected. They're directly involved with the act of prescribing those drugs with the intention of your death. This is not, as I say, a secondary effect, right? This is a direct effect. And so in the case of euthanasia, they're not only what they're then doing is they're actually injecting them, as I say, which is an exception to homicide. So we're talking murder. It is murder every time they lethally inject someone. And in 2021, we had 10,064 reported euthanasia deaths in Canada, and those were all lethal injection. They were killed that way. And we should all be concerned about this, because obviously speaking, you don't want to go to a doctor in your time of need when maybe you're going through a lot of psychological distress. I have to remind people, they think, let's just cut to the chase. They would say, but this is about someone's choice. They've asked for this. And I would say, well, wait a second here. Is it not normal for a human being who's going through difficult health problems to also be affected by that psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually? Is that not normal, as we are as human beings, that maybe we're so down by our situation that we might be very lonely? We've gone into a sort of a deep type of a depression, or this existential question that's so deep that we just want to be we want to be out of life.
Let me ask you this. Is it presented now, if you go to a doctor in these 10 states or in Canada and Europe, wherever it is, and say, well, doctor says to patient, well, these are the things that, you can do. Plus, if you just want to die, we could do this too. How does that work? I mean, does the doctor present as a course of action?
It depends on what state you're in or what doctor you go to, because obviously some doctors are very pro-death, and they would see it as, let's say you're coming to them and you have a significant health problem. They would see it as their responsibility to make sure you know that this option is available to you, and they would present it to you. Whereas others would say, no, we just don't do that, okay? So the other thing is, some states, they make it very clear that it's only offered to someone who's requested it. So if you don't request it, it's not brought up. Whereas in other places like Canada, they're seeing it as something that you must present as an option, because if you have a terminal, or let's say significant chronic condition, you would then qualify, and therefore you should be offered all your options.
This is becoming more, folks, this is becoming more and more popular. I meet a lot of people that say to me, Father, I don't mind dying. I just don't want to be bothered with the whole thing. Dying is a painful process sometimes, and oftentimes not physically painful only, but psychologically painful. The bottom line is, God gave us this life. This is not our life just to give up or take away whenever we feel like it. Sometimes there's great redemptive merit in suffering. Pain sometimes can be offered up along with the cross of Christ, and we can become holier through pain. However, we don't want people, we talked about this earlier, to think, well, I'm going to suffer, but they go into despair. They give up on God's mercy. So, we have to be very, very careful as to how we deal with people who are ill, but we got to make it perfectly clear that we are never, ever permitted to take our own life, or that's like suicide. And in our case here right now, euthanasia. We just can't have people providing us with means to take our own life, or having people making that decision for us, like the state making that decision. This is one of the most dangerous things that's ever happened. It began with abortion, folks. If you could do it at the beginning of life, you could do it at the end of life. And here's where we are right now. Now, Alex, I'm so happy that you're working on this. You're going around speaking about it, I guess, all over the Western world, yes?
Yeah, all over the world, yeah.
Yeah. And, we want to make sure that people understand that we try to distinguish all the differences today, active and passive, morphine and hospice and freedom and those things that, as human beings, we have rights to, but also those things that we have no rights to. And so what I'm going to ask you folks is, when you confront this problem in your own state, to make sure that you know that you do not have the right to take your life. Only God does. Alex, I want to thank you. You've been a great guest. God bless you and keep up your good work.
Thank you very much.
Alex is for action. I'm for action. And I hope you are too. We would like to thank our generous sponsors for their wonderful support. Thanks for watching. Please join us next time for Action for Life. I'm for action, and I hope you are too. I'm Father Michael Orsi. I am your host for Action for Life Television, that good news program which talks about the gospel of Jesus Christ, the big G, and the little g, all the good things that people are doing to put the gospel of life into action. So please join us for the next episode of Action for Life.